what you've done with the,
Right, I see the live video. So that, yay, it's working. Oh, good. All right, we're live on Facebook. And I'm so happy to be back with our New Jerusalem discussion group. Hope some others will join us virtually on Facebook. And I am here in person with, well, not in person, here on Zoom with Barb Boxwell from Michigan. You want to say hi, Barb?
Hi there.
Great. And I'm also here with Paul Deming from St. Louis, Missouri. Is that where St. Louis is? Oh my goodness.
Is great. Gateway City. That's right.
Okay. My horrible geography has been revealed. I've been to St. Louis. I should know that it's in Missouri. So we're here to talk about chapter, I guess this is the fourth chapter, love in general. And I thought it might be nice to just quickly recap where we've been. This is Swedenborg's work, New Jerusalem. And in some ways, he's trying to be concise here to narrow down what it is that this new church that's coming into being is going to include. Hey, Renee, she's joining us. Great. So we started off hearing about the vision of the New Jerusalem descending from heaven, and that this is an image of what this new church is going to be. We heard about how first God formed a new heaven, and we heard about what that new heaven was like. We heard about how that new heaven includes Christians and non-Christians, and that this new heaven is now going to manifest as a new earth and a new church. The first element we discussed was goodness and truth. That kind of the first job of being the new church is to be recipients of goodness and truth, to be open to goodness and truth. Then we heard about the will and the understanding and the role within us of those two functions to receive goodness and to receive truth, and how as human beings we're given the ability to think one thing and will something else, which is how we evolve and how we grow, and also how we make ourselves crazy and cause lots of trouble. So we talked about that a bit. Hey, Ralph, glad you're joining us today. And then last week, we talked about the inner and outer self, which is a huge dimension of this new church, that we are simultaneously existing here in the physical world and also in the spiritual world, and that we're receiving life from the spiritual world, but then called to manifest that life in the material world. And that understanding is really central to this new church. And now finally this week we get to start talking about love, which is so central and at the heart of the church and our call to life. Hey, Karen, glad you're joining us. And we'll actually be talking about love the next 3 weeks. And this week's chapter on love is titled just Love in General. So Paul and Barb, we have an opportunity to really, this can be a wide-ranging conversation, and I'd encourage you to let it be a heartful conversation, to talk about love, to try to bring our intellect down to earth in our experience. What is this mysterious force of love that we sing about, we talk about? Swedenborg tells us it's the central point of life. It's who we are. It's our very substance. I think this conversation can go in a lot of directions. So I wonder, Paul or Barb, if you want to start off with either a passage that particularly stuck out to you, either because it really resonated or maybe because you had questions about it. Where do you guys want to begin?
Barb, I defer to you.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, I was particularly interested in the passage on number 55. Whatever we love more than anything else is constantly present within our thoughts and within our will. And, trying to determine for myself, what is that? What is I think about all the time? And that's sometimes difficult, I think, to manage and to be aware of. Because so many times we get caught up in the daily news, what's going on with our friends, it's everything that's external, but what are we really loving on the inside? And so I was really taken by that.
Yeah. That idea of one of the ways he talks about it is the ruling love, that there's something in us that is unifying. And I agree with you, Barb. Sometimes it's hard to know what that is because modern life especially is so, we're pulled in so many directions. And he really points out that our ruling love can be, he points out one ruling love could be wealth, that you could love wealth more than anything else. And that could be the thing that is actually preoccupying you the most. I certainly feel like I think this is one of the things that grows and changes as we regenerate, as we grow, as we regenerate. When we're younger, maybe our ruling love is pleasure or wanting esteem or wanting wealth, maybe wanting adventure. And yet part of the process of growth is kind of whittling things down. And as we get older, we maybe start to get clearer on the things that are really important to us. It may take more shape. Paul, how do you feel about that passage? Do you feel like you sometimes know what your ruling love is, or know what's sort of at the heart of things, or is it that's hard to know that?
Yeah, I think it's within us deeply. Sometimes it's a subconscious level.
Yeah.
I like that Lee Wolfenden calls it primary or controlling love. Mm-hmm. And this coincides so well with the next number 56, because that talks about how this love can carry us like a hidden current. Mm-hmm. And I'm reminded of there was a Hungarian-born psychologist. He died a couple years ago, but his name was Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. Mm-hmm. And he wrote a book called Flow. And it was about how we can get so immersed into doing something that we love that we lose the sense of everything else going on around us. Mm-hmm. So I was thinking in my life, there's a profound love of music. And my wife could tell you that there are times at night, if I'm writing, if I'm working on my guitar or piano or something, and I feel like a song is just, being birthed within me, I can lose all track of time. I might look up and it's 4 a.m. and I was, oh my goodness. But, it's something that you get so into. And so you're not always conscious. I'm not saying to myself, well, I'm doing this because I love music. It's just something that's within me. There's a current flowing and I get into that flow, and some people call it in the zone, but it's just being so totally immersed in something that you love. Yeah. And I have to compliment this program, because last week when Jim Lawrence was talking about what he called the GUK factor, G-U-K, and G stands for generosity, and U stands for usefulness, and K stands for kindness. I think when it becomes part of who we are through the regeneration process, we don't think about being kind or useful or generous. It's just who we are. It's just what emanates from our center. Mm-hmm. So I think about our ruling love that way. It's what emanates from within us. And there's even a mention about, if we're self-absorbed, then we're the kind of people that are listening to others, but always thinking about what we're going to say and using every opportunity to turn our discussions into something about ourselves. Mm-hmm. Those are just little red flags that go off to me. within myself or when I hear it in other people, that's it's probably a reality check that maybe we're still focused on ourselves, that we forget how to be useful and generous, and kind to others.
Yeah. What's coming up listening to you, Paul, is thinking about, or that what he's saying is that this is true for all of us, that we all have this love in us, that we all have been created with kind of a beautiful jewel, something particular to bring, and that doesn't mean we always know what it is. And that's okay, that it's still at work. My husband and I went and saw the documentary that just came out about Carlos Santana, and we just loved it. It was so beautiful. And he's just like, he knew from a very young age that this is what he wanted to do in his life, and he just did it. And I loved watching it, but I was also like a little jealous, like that he knew what his instrument was, he knew what he had to bring. And I think for myself, especially, I don't know, the world doesn't always offer us the best opportunities to discern what our instrument is. A lot of our modern world is really kind of sticking us in categories and trying to encourage us to master skills that might not really resonate with our heart. And so sometimes discovering what our ruling love is, or to honor it, is sometimes to honor it, just like trust that it's there, even if it is totally unclear how to bring it about, and to sort of experiment and wonder. I'm jealous of musicians because I feel like you always have it figured out, but it's okay to not know. And what I'm starting to trust more and more is that everyone has like medicine for the world. Everyone has something to bring that the world needs, and it may not have, it may not fit any category, but maybe the medicine is even more important when it isn't clear, when it isn't specific, but through the context that we are grown and where the intersections of life around us, we have something to offer, something to bring. And so to have that ruling love be for our highest use for God kind of means letting it unfold, not having a whole lot of control over what it's all going to be. Hey, Robin, glad you're joining us, and Missy's here. Yeah.
Well, you said something last week that I really, really loved, and I may have commented to you about it, but you quoted Secrets, I think, 5396. Remind us, but I think you were referring to the angelic choirs.
Yeah.
And suggested that they are within us when we choose and do the right thing.
Yeah.
And that's, to me, that just resonated so well.
Right.
There's a passage in Proverbs that says, my child, if your heart is wise, my own heart will also be glad, and my innermost being will rejoice when your lips speak what is right. To me, that's the choir within singing hallelujah when we say and do the right thing. Or if you're a parent and you have a child that says and does the right thing, it's that kind of rejoicing within. I love that, I really do. That's the musician within all of us.
Yeah. And that passage that I quoted last week, what I loved about it was the description he had of how chaotic everything was around the choir. And it was really a wonderful description of how life feels sometimes, where everything is chaotic and things are not matching up. And I don't know what my instrument is, and it all feels just like a holy mess. But that there's this choir, this song, that is trying to be sung. And I think I brought this up another week. Someone I listened to that I really love was talking about intuition and what it is to listen to, and thinking of intuition as that choir, that voice within, that part of us within. What does it take to align ourselves with that? And what she said is, it takes incredible humility and a willingness to be really, really wrong over and over again, which I just think is so wise. Like, to know that choir is within us, and also know we're gonna perceive, we're gonna get it off sometimes, and we're not gonna get it. We're not gonna, maybe some people, maybe the holiest of holy ones of us have the direct line and just say it clear, but most of us are having to sift that deep wisdom through layers of conditioning and stories, and so we're going to get it a little wrong, but that's how we get there, is by making mistake after mistake after mistake, and continuing to just try, not giving up and believing that the song's not still there, even as we falter. Karen comments, "Oh yay, please tell me that it's okay to get it really, really wrong over and over again." Yes, I think it is. And I think that's how we become humble, right? Humility is kind of a necessary quality that we need to develop along the spiritual path. And how do we become humble? By screwing up, by not getting it right many, many, many times. Yeah. What else should we say about this, about specifically kind of Swedenborg's concept of love?
I guess I struggle with something, and I like everyone's opinion about this.
Great.
My son and he lives in Wisconsin, so we talk a lot by phone and through text messages, and he tends to lean a little to the right politically, and I tend to lean a little to the left politically, and we have some spirited conversations between us, as you might imagine. But one thing that we appreciate about each other is that we know that we both love what is good and what is true. Sometimes defining those things are a little different. But he mentioned to me this week the yin and yang, and that symbol that you all are familiar with. It represents the symbiotic relationship of opposites. And Swedenborg said, and I can't tell you where this quote came from, but he said, to the extent that you hate falsity, you love truth. And I was thinking that the two kinds of love that he mentions in this passage are the source of everything that is true and good, and the source of everything that is evil and false. I guess what I struggle with is the symbiotic nature of that, because it almost suggests that there's a balance within us of evil and false. And I don't want there to be any evil and false within me. So I guess the question about it is, what is the symbiotic nature of that relationship? And maybe someone can illumine me as to whether or not the yin and yang apply here.
Well, see, and that's what I struggle with all the time. But there's another thing that I'm trying to grasp, and that is, instead of there being a good and this duality that we live in, that we look at it as both and that it goes, so we do away with the good, bad, right, wrong, and we embrace the whole as being necessary and acceptable, appreciated as both and I struggle with this because I look at and make that determination, that judgment of the world as being, how could this possibly exist? And yeah, I don't want the bad to be in me, but I certainly recognize there are things that I don't think I ever want to do again, because I've learned from that. And that's part of the transformation and reformation. So I don't know whether that's helpful or not.
That's very helpful. Renee adds a comment too. Swedenborg suggests that the lower loves are to serve the higher loves ultimately. And that's sort of in the vein I was starting to go listening to the two of you, that, falsity, and we talked about this in the earlier chapter with good and truth. Something that's true for a while can become false. Something that works for you for a little bit and has a lot of truth in it and has goodness in it. Eventually you can come to determine, is it true that we live in the United States of America? Sort of, but we also live on planet Earth, and we also live in the spiritual world. There's a lot of ways in which I believe that as our brains have evolved, and as we've evolved language, as we've started to name the things that we see and name them as separate entities, in some ways that's already a falsity, because we're all one life. We're all one life in God. So I think falsity is it's, what's the word I'm looking for? It's built into our humanity, because it's just something we kind of have to navigate in our attempt to understand and in our attempt to communicate with each other. And I think he points that out in the chapter on goodness and truth, that a falsity can contain good as long as it comes from a good place. It's not evil. It's, as long as it's sort of a useful falsity, it's okay. But that part of our regeneration is to release more and more of those falsities and see bigger truths. And maybe that's a yin and a yang. Maybe the yin and the yang is the relationship between what is ultimately true and the truth that we kind of have to. I need to believe I'm an American citizen because I need a license and I need to pay taxes. There's things I have to do in this realm, and sometimes we have shared stories about who we are that are useful and that we all get behind, but then sometimes we start to realize their limits and we need to change those stories. And that's part of our growth and part of the evolution of the world. Missy has a comment on here. Not sure who described this to me years ago, maybe Dorothea Harvey, but when I think of this conflict or opposition, I always see it as turning towards God and away from God. I see this as the yin yang. I can't always understand with thinking, but I can often with feeling. And that's I can resonate with that idea of as we turn towards God and turning away, and Swedenborg would say that falsities emerge as we turn away, but we can always turn back. And we're sort of turning, we come round right. I think you quoted that earlier in our discussion, Paul. Life continues to turn. But I appreciate what you shared, Barb, of that it's in all of, and this is where the spiritual path goes totally off the rails when we start to believe that we're only in the good team, and we're only focused on God. There's no falsity in me at all. That's a big part, I think, of the vision of the new church and of what Swedenborg invites us to. He gets a little, he does get very black and white sometimes about stuff, but he's describing something that we're all experiencing. We all have all of it. And insofar as we can accept the full range of our human experience, one, it helps us to be humble because we can accept others instead of, I think our big human thing is to say, I have the truth and you have the falsity. And so when we can see it in ourselves and accept it, there's a softening that can happen. And I think a maturity.
Well, and it's really hard because we live in this world where if we do something bad, then we feel like we need to be punished, or there's going to be some kind of hell and damnation come upon us. Whereas, how can we be kind and loving to that part of us that didn't know and didn't understand and made a mistake? It's like,
and that's the key.
Hard. This is not easy stuff.
And we haven't made it easy. Maya Angelou has that beautiful quote, when we know better, we do better. And to realize that when we don't do better, it's because we don't know better. And, Jesus said the same thing, forgive them for they know not what they do, as he was dying on the cross. He realized that the people who were enacting these things didn't really even know the full severity of what they were involved in, and that in that way, they could be forgiven. And I think we need to get much better at forgiveness, that it's not about, that it is about acknowledging our ignorance. It's about acknowledging our that we didn't have consciousness. And then when we do have consciousness, then we start to feel for what we've done. Sometimes the weight of that can just be harrowing, where we just feel horrible, and it can be difficult to release. But that's exactly the moment where it's time to say, oh, wow, I did not know, and now I do, and I am so sorry. And that's when we turn back towards God. And Renee made a good comment about that falsity and evil is really when we're intentionally turning away from God, when we know it's wrong and we choose it, and that's a different thing than being unconscious, than not knowing. But then once you do know, how do you change instead of wallowing in the wrong you've done? How do you receive that? And I feel like that's one of the questions of our time, as we wrestle with white supremacy and racism and all the harms of our ancestors. And I mean, it's overwhelming. It could make us all just not want to try anything. We could become overwhelmed by that. But to realize that that all of that is, that we are free to be forgiven, that we can move through these things, and we can change, and we can go a new way, is so important if we're going to live into this new church and this new world that we're invited into.
I love that.
We have another edition from Tassie. This is a quote from Secrets of Heaven. Humiliation, interesting. Humiliation is the essential of divine worship. When we are in a state of humiliation from self-acknowledgement, we are in a state of reception of good and truth from the Lord. And maybe humiliation's, that's a tough word for me, I know, but we were talking about being humbled. And that part of releasing unconsciousness is to say, I didn't know, my human screwed up. I am humiliated. And yet I'm still a child of God. And now I'm going to repent from my sin. I'm going to say, no, I don't want to be that way anymore. And then I can have a whole new life of receiving God's love, not of now me being a superstar, me being the best one on the planet, but now I'm able to receive more love from God and more direction from God, because I know more. And yeah.
Well, I'm going to harp back to 56, that passage you're reading. I just love that particular passage. I talked about the current, drawing us, how we get into the flow of things. But that particular chapter, that particular verse ends with, what is loved above all is also something we look for and see in others, and something we use sometimes to influence them or cooperate with them. I'm looking at that from the aspect of seeing it in others as something that we kind of fine tune that and hone that skill. The more we look toward God, the more we look for God in others. And I think I mentioned this a couple weeks ago, that there was this Dottie Rambo tune that she put to she put these words to the tune of "Oh Danny Boy," which was my father's favorite Irish melody, and it was something like "Amazing grace will always be my song of praise, for it was grace that bought my liberty." We could talk about that. "I'll never know just how he came to love me so. He looked beyond my faults and saw my needs." I think sometimes looking for a God in others, we can see where there are needs, and we can see where people are on their own path to regeneration. And I think it's again something that there's this, I shared this just Sunday, out of Psalm 116, there's this one verse that says, "With God at my side, I will not be hurt." And I was thinking, well, how can that be true? We get hurt all the time. We hurt each other all the time. And then I kind of looked at it from this perspective. Maybe when it says, I will not be hurt, it is saying, I will choose not to be offended when somebody hurts me.
Mhm.
And that to me that resonated with me so much more than some claim that I will not be hurt because God's on my side. The truth of it is, I need to make a conscious choice to not be offended when there are millions of reasons around me that I could be offended. But I'm choosing not to be. I'm choosing to go with that, choosing to see the love of God in others
Yeah.
or their
Well,
needs.
when your love is, when we're in that ideal orientation with God first, then I think that what has to come with that is a certain amount of acceptance, because that means there is a recognition of God being God and we're us being human. So all of my ideas about how everything should go and about how everyone should be are kind of put in right relationship. And when I think about when I'm hurt, often I'm hurt because I wanted things to be a certain way. I wanted to be loved in a certain way. I wanted to be listened to in a certain way, and it doesn't come out. And someone does something that often it's an ego hurt. It's we can be physically hurt too. I mean, we are vulnerable creatures. That does happen. And I would say all of us struggle every day with multiple ego hurts or, relational wounds that have to do with kind of, wanting to be loved in a certain way, wanting to be seen in a certain way. So if we can become more humble and release some of that and just think of God first, I could see how that could protect us from some of that hurt. Or again, it's like everything that happened, we're in the river. Oh, it's happened. Okay. And more, I think people are starting to realize that the things people say to us to hurt us say a lot more about them than they do about us. That it's much more about what's, we expose ourselves in the way that we treat each other. And so in that way, we can try to have a little compassion when someone is cruel or hurtful. We got some nice additions from the chat. Robin offered, there's a saying that St. Francis of Assisi was known as the unforgiving because he didn't take offense to anything and had no need to forgive. I love that, Robin. And I've heard that from other teachers about if you don't have much ego, then there's nothing to forgive. And if you accept that people are not doing this, it's their own stuff, then there's nothing, the wound doesn't happen that needs to be repaired. And that's interesting that St. Francis of Assisi may have had that state, that consciousness. I think of Jesus. I mean, was he hurt on the cross? I mean, yeah, probably. I don't know. That's a good question. There was a certain degree of surrender there. And then Renee offers, Paul, somewhere in Swedenborg, I once read that angels are perpetually making excuses for us, thinking the very best of us in all things. I love that.
There must be several volumes in my case then.
Yeah.
Thank you, Renee. It's beautiful.
I wonder about just bringing the conversation around to Swedenborg's. In paragraph 60, we hear something that I emphasize this a lot when I'm talking about Swedenborg's view of things and our understanding that there are these 4 levels of love. There's God, the neighbor, the world, and the self. And in paragraph 60, he makes this real distinction that everything good and true comes from having our orientation towards love of God and love of the neighbor, and that everything false comes in when our orientation is towards the world and the self. And I just wondered what you two thought of those levels. It's something that I think about a lot, and I find it useful to to consider those four in order.
Yeah, I think
Well,
it stems again to our essence, right? The essence of God within us. I'm sorry, Barb, I think you were about to say something.
no, that's okay. Go ahead.
Well, I've struggled with this too because we do need to have a certain amount of love for ourselves, but as it's pointed out in later chapters, it's for the purpose of maintaining our own health and our own well-being, so that we can be useful to others, so that we can serve God, so that we can be the goodness and truth that we love so much. It certainly makes sense to me, but of course, that hierarchy of loves is what keeps it in check, keeps it in balance.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, and what I do have to say goes along the same line is I think there's so much of what goes on in the world that's hurtful is the lack of self-love. I mean, real self-love. People who are damaged, traumatized throughout their life, have very little self-worth or value. It appears as if they're the ones that are, doing the things that are evil. They're looking for something of value to value in themselves. And so I struggle with this a lot, because how can you love your neighbor as yourself if you first don't have or honor the God within you and give credence and value to that? And maybe it's not selfish love, but it is love of the God within you and the life that you're here to give. And if we don't have that, then I don't see how we can love God and the neighbor.
Yeah. I think that's so well articulated, Barb. I think about that a lot. And I think this is where it's like, I bet you Swedenborg loved himself pretty good. I don't think he had a whole lot of self-esteem issues. It was partly who he was. And so he could see this easily. But I think it really does need to be interpreted. And I realize that I realize this in myself, and I wonder if it's true for others who are struggling, that with my own struggle with self-esteem or to trust the God within me, when I look at that hierarchy, sometimes I think, oh, well, to love God first means something that some other person or some church could tell me, and that I have to kind of fulfill some external expectation to love God first. And that's not, I don't think that's true. I think that's a real false perception that can come when we don't really value the God within us. And so what's shifted for me is to realize that to love God first means exactly that. It means to love the God that created me, that's creating me, that's in me. And so I have to love this meat suit that's, allowing me to have this experience. I have to love all of it, everything that I'm bringing. And that's, and ultimately he's describing 4 levels, and they're separate, but ultimately they're all connected, right? We love the God within us that's manifesting through our physicality that only exists because of our relationships to others. I mean, I wouldn't be sage if I didn't have parents that named me, and we can't exist apart. We are together. And so the love needs to flow through our community, and then it needs to flow through all the world. Ultimately, those 4 things are inherently connected. And maybe the use of separating them is only insofar as if we are kind of on a negative path. I know for myself, sometimes if I'm really stressed out or really anxious, I'll think about, like, what is my highest purpose here? And sometimes it will be about making sure something happens in the world that I want it to, or it will be about making sure I look good, or making sure, so I think I find the hierarchy somewhat helpful as I go further along, but I agree with you, Barb, that it's hard to really even get started if you don't have that foundational sense of belonging on the planet, belonging in the world. And I think that's one of the primary wounds for many people, that we should be sensitive of when we're teaching this stuff and when we're speaking about it. Renee offers to Barb, I think of Swedenborg's theology of discrete degrees. I believe there are infinite levels or degrees of self-love in the healthy and destructive senses, and God is leading us according to the degree of self-love we have. Yeah. Well, I would also say, I feel like ultimately, just like if we love our neighbor, we want to love our neighbor as ourselves. We want to, that the love of self, as we start to go along, we realize I'm the same as you, that there's not, but maybe when self-love is perverted is when it's more about how can I be different than you? How can I be better than you? How can I be, set apart from you? That's sort of the earthly selfish love that I think Swedenborg he wants to point out that that's destructive, the positioning that happens as a human. But the deeper love that makes room for, there's plenty of love for everybody. Once we tap into that, then loving ourselves is a very important act. And some of my favorite writers and authors right now talk about like radical self-care, like that we are not good at taking care of ourselves. We have not been trained well in this planet. And so it's important, it's really vital to listen to what we need and what we want, because it's through that listening that we're actually listening to God, to what God needs and what God wants from us. And sometimes we need to do some self-care so we have the resources to do that, to put our own mask on first before we can help others. Yeah. Got about 15 more minutes. I wonder if there's any directions about this chapter that we haven't gone that we want to go. Or
I
anything more.
mention that I'm deeply troubled about what's happening in Israel right now.
Mhm.
And it kind of boils down to, again, what people communicate. And what's interesting is if you're on Facebook or TikTok or any number of the other social platforms, you'll see arguments for and against, for Hamas against Israel, for Israel against Hamas. And I think we just beginning to see the tip of the iceberg in terms of protest and people associating with one side or another. And the thing I guess I'm troubled about is that whatever we are fed media-wise, we still have to have a discerning spirit about what's true and what's good. And it gets increasingly challenging for our news feeds, our current social feeds, the information that we're privy to or that we hear in the span of a day. And I guess I'm just bringing this up to see if anyone has any spiritual insight to offer about how we can cope with this kind of madness in the world. I think I've mentioned to some of you before, my mother was Ukrainian. So every Sunday, our church prays for Ukraine, but now we'll be praying for Israel as well, and for the conflict to be resolved over there, as we've been praying for the conflict to be resolved in Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah. I don't think I have any answers, Paul. I share in the grief with you and with so many people around the planet. I think for me, it makes me more and more committed to what I perceive as the work of the new church, which is making room for all the tribes of all the nations to come together in peace. It points out to me just how, talk about, interpersonal hurt with misperception. can become war, that there's not a huge distinction between the lack of peace that we experience in our very, simple personal familial lives and the hurt that experiences around the world. And I really,
Something
I
that I'd
see
like
one of
to
the primary problems, one of the
say,
primarily,
when
go ahead.
we were talking about self-love
Mhm.
and talking about the fact that not having value, we can shift that, I think, to what's going on in the world and the fact that we have nations warring against each other. Rather than taking sides, maybe we need to pray for all of them.
Mhm.
That, what causes the conflict? It's value. We have devalued, or there are people who feel devalued, and it's their way of saying, look, if you don't acknowledge me,
Mm.
I'm going to do something that's going to cause you to acknowledge me. Whether it's right or wrong, there is hurt, there's ego, there is an underlying devalued system. And I think we as the new church, and this is hard, how do you pray for your enemies?
Mhm.
How do you embrace that?
Yeah.
I don't know, but I think it's worth doing to find out whether that makes an impact.
Yeah, that's just it, Barb. I think we pray for everyone. And how is that drama playing out for me? And how can I open my heart to those I would disagree with or would see as an enemy? This is the whole thing. Love, we're talking about this as a universal thing, that all of us have this love in us, that we're all created in God's image, that we're all, and yet we have set ourselves apart from one another over the course of our history and developed different identities and religions and cultures. And in some ways that's all incredibly beautiful and good and creative, and we wouldn't have the incredible diversity that we have now if that hadn't happened. And these identities are in many places in our world at war. We don't believe they can coexist. And we don't even know how to communicate with each other about, because of historical beliefs about who to trust, who not to trust, who's safe. I mean, it's heart-wrenching. And it's the moment that we're living in is seeing that and kind of understanding it a little more deeply than people maybe did in the past. And now what will we choose to do about it? How will we choose to move forward? I'm really getting interested in, and I think love is a good topic to discuss this, that, we don't have a lot of good language for talking about the stuff between us that actually makes life worth living. Like, I can talk about Barb, and I can talk about Paul, and I can talk about my computer, and I can talk about the tree over there. I can talk about things, but in terms of what actually keeps communities flowing and moving, what actually makes, the love, the stuff that draws us together and creates, we have lots of different languages to talk about that, like religious language, spiritual language, psychological language. Like we're starting to talk about it, but we all have very different words for things. So we don't often have a common language to talk about our hurts and our longings and our hopes. And I find that problem to be engaging and interesting. And I think especially as members of the new church, because we have our own language to talk about it. And our language sometimes is even more niche than others. but that it's what's needed in the world, is a way to come together to talk about our common needs and our common humanity. And the real healing that I see happening around the planet is when actual human beings from different, cultures, religions come together and become friends, realize their common humanity, realize that there's that the barriers and the assumptions that they had about each other. It doesn't solve everything immediately, but to me, it's the path. And so how do we find ways to communicate across differences about what's most important, what really makes us human and makes life joyful. And we need to learn how to do that in new ways. And I feel like a lot of people are learning to do that in new ways, new kind of global initiatives, people crossing boundaries, crossing national boundaries, crossing religious boundaries to kind of knit communities back together. And it may not end war tomorrow, but to me, it's vital to what we're being called to do. And then we just grieve and we feel for the pain around the world, and pray that something shifts. Renee mentioned, Paul, perhaps the church can facilitate dialogue and discussion about war itself, how spiritual warfare within the individual is the beginning and source of all wars. What is the body-mind spiritual need behind war? And then Karen mentions, anybody want to say anything about number 83? Oh, how our inner evils come from our fathers, and our outer ones from our mothers. Let's shift the conversation for our last 9 minutes and talk about number 83. Thanks, Karen. Let's see. We should address that. That's a good question. Yeah, what we inherit is loving ourselves and loving the world. The evils we inherit from our parents and ancestors reach back in a long sequence, increasing and building up. What the heck? That's Karen's response to that statement. Well, yes, I agree with what the heck. I'd say that would be my first response. Swedenborg he has a very particular idea about gender. For him, the father corresponds to truth, to spiritual truth, to the spiritual realm, and the mother corresponds to the body, the earth. So I think it pretty much comes down to that distinction between outer and inner. For him, the father always has to do with the inner and the mother has to do with the outer, which was a pretty common idea in his time. Feels kind of empty to me at this point in our human evolution. But what do you guys think, Paul or Barb?
It's a tough one. I think the last paragraph of 83 helps me a little bit. Our inherited evils are evils that arise from self-love and love for the world. So I think that helps a little bit, but it kind of boils down to what you were saying earlier, Sage, that it's our common humanity that draws us again to seeing a bigger picture, with wars, with conflicts, with our own internal struggles. And another pastor once said to me, I really think Christianity is under attack today. And I just looked at him and I said, humanity is under attack today. And if there's anything that Christ showed us, it was the importance of getting back to our common humanity and finding out what it is that draws us together instead of pulls us apart. Sage, am I able to share the screen to show you something?
Let me see. Try now.
Okay. All right, that's just something I decided to share with you guys if you can see it. I don't know.
Mhm. I think so.
But a quote from the Dalai Lama: "The reason why the world is in chaos is because things are being loved and people are being used." So people were created to be loved. Things
Mhm.
were created to be used.
Yeah.
And again, it kind of gets back to, where we are.
Yeah.
And the only other thing I wanted to share with you, I'm just going to put this up there. And if any of you want to do a screen capture to capture any of this for later discussion, but I thought this poem from C.S. Lewis might be something to talk about next week when we're talking about love of self and love of the world. He wrote this after his beloved Joy Davidson passed away. And I think, again, when you're talking about loss or you're talking about people dealing with pain, it kind of makes us face our own self-absorption, to the extent that we have been putting our own needs above others. So again, just those two things I wanted to share with you.
Thank you, Paul. Yeah. And maybe that Dalai Lama quote kind of points out the way love of the world can, when Swedenborg talks about love of the world, I don't know. I don't know that he's talking about paramecium, and feels like he's talking about like the structures of the world. And when we are loving things or even ideas or about people versus the people themselves, that's what creates, that's where we forget about, we dehumanize each other. We don't think of each other as lived beings anymore. We're thinking about the identities that we hold, and that's what can cause so much havoc. And one last comment about the male female divide that Karen brought up was just that, to me, I think a lot of, in thinking about correspondences and that everything in nature has a correspondence, it's reasonable to think that the masculine has a different correspondence to the feminine, and that brings different energies. I think it just becomes problematic when we then say, oh, and then that means that you as a human with the specific genitalia that you have to be a certain way. That these are bigger elements, bigger energies. And I don't necessarily also though think that Swedenborg had totally right, that everything masculine has to do with the inner and everything feminine has to do with the outer. But there's a polarity. There's a way in which those two things are expressed in the male female continuum that exists throughout creation. And it's sort of, this actually brings us full circle. The yin yang symbol is a good one, because it's this idea of the two being separate, but the other is always contained in the other one. So there's none of it is trying to cause division, or if it becomes a way in which we other each other, or we put each other in boxes, then it's harmful. It's not useful. And I fear that there are places that Swedenborg does stumble into that and does say things that are just kind of unuseful at this point. There is something about the masculine energy of the world, and there is something about the feminine energy of the world. And I think that that's actually sort of useful at this point in our history, because we're realizing, you know what, we need a little more feminine energy in our world. It's been a little bit too masculine for too long. And we need to pay attention to the outer, the body, the realm of nature, and not just think we're disembodied heads, trying to make everything perfect. So as long as we don't devalue one or the other and create a hierarchy, which is what we humans like to do, then we can think about those different energies and their role to play, and know that they play out in all of us, no matter what our presentation might be. So this has been a great discussion, and have 30 seconds left. Do either of you have a last word that you want to leave? I know, Paul, you sort of shared a couple last words. What about you, Barb? Any last word about
no
love?
ongoing words, but not last.
Not last.
I just want to say thank you again for this format, the
Yeah.
opportunity for this discussion. It's really
I'm
valuable.
so glad our technology worked and we had such a great crew joining us this morning. Thank you for all your comments. And we'll be back again next week. And we just got started with love. The next 2 chapters are all about love. So we'll have lots more time to talk about it. And next week in this view of love, I'll have a married couple joining me. Kurt Feckety and Shelley Dolly will be here for the
Great.
discussion. And I hope the rest of you will join us on Facebook.
Great,
So
thank you.
enjoy your day. Thanks so much, Barb and Paul. This has been great. Signing off.